Just going to give it another minute here and then we'll be getting going. Thank you for joining us on your Friday lunchtime. We're just going to give it another couple seconds and then we'll get going. All right, we're coming up on 3 minutes after the hour. It looks like we have a critical mass of participants. So I'd just like to thank you all for joining us on a Friday, lovely Friday afternoon in upstate New York and wherever you are. Thank you for attending this session, Land Use Strategies for Flood Resilience. It's part of the 2021 Joint Planning Conference hosted by the New York Upstate Chapter of the American Planning Association and the New York Planning Federation. My name is Mark Castiglione, and I'll be your host and sort of technical support for the presenters here today. A little housekeeping before we begin. I'd just like to thank our conference premier sponsor, Hodgson & Russ, and the sponsor for this session, C&S Companies. Without our partners, this virtual conference would not be possible. We also wanted to let you know that all of our sessions are being recorded and will be made available through the conference Eventbrite event page as videos become available and are posted. AICP planners can claim CM credit by watching video recordings of these sessions. Planning and zoning board members may be eligible to receive training credits by watching videos depending on the rules of their local boards or municipalities. All attendees are automatically muted. If you have any questions, please submit them in the Q&A box. We will try to address those questions as best we can. We are providing, I'll provide in the chat box the CM credit number for the professional planners out there wanting to look it up. As a good reminder, all registrants will receive an email after you attend this session as proof of your attendance of this session that you can use to submit for your planning and zoning board credits. That email typically comes about 24 hours after this session. So be on the lookout for it around noontime tomorrow. So this session as flood resilience strategies, it's a hot topic nowadays. We are in the midst of climate change. There's a lot of new regulations coming out. There's a lot of best practices to help be more resilient and to mitigate the impacts of climate change and certainly be prepared to manage flooding and certainly know where flooding is happening in communities. That's why we're so lucky today to have experts in the field to talk and share their experiences and talk about the intersection between land use planning and floodplain management. Our first speaker today is Janet Thigpen. She's a certified floodplain manager with a BA in geology from Carleton College and a master's of science in geology from Cornell. She works for the Southern Tier Central Regional Planning and Development Board and implemented a regional flood resilience program since 1996. The program provides a regional basis for technical planning and assistance for communities in the Southern Tier region. She is also a founding member of the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association and currently serves as the co-chair of the Public Policy Committee and the New York Community Rating System Users Group. Our next speaker is John Caterino. He's a planner with the town of Greece, and he's been employed with the town for over 11 years. He primarily focuses on planning, zoning, special projects, comprehensive planning, floodplain management, GIS, and economic development. As any good planner, he's a jack of all trades. Look at that. Anything that you have, just throw it John, he'll take care of it. He holds an undergraduate degree in geography and political science and a master's of science and international studies, and is currently performing graduate work in community and economic development at Penn State University. We are Penn State. He's a certified floodplain manager and building code enforcement officer. He's a member of the American Planning Association, thank you, John, and GIS SIG organization, and serves on the board of directors of the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association. And last but certainly not least is Brent Gossage. I hope I pronounced that correctly. One of my jobs is to make sure I get the pronunciations correct, and I forgot to do that today, but he is a resource educator with Cornell Cooperative Extension from Ulster County, which is a partner agency to the Ashokan Watershed Stream Management Program, along with Ulster County Soil and Water Conservation District, New York City Department of Environmental Protection. Since 2011, he's provided educational services and delivered programming in the Ashokan Watershed for individuals, municipal officials on a diverse array of flood mitigation and management topics. Interesting planning in the New York City watershed up there. Interesting considerations for doing that. He and his colleagues have spearheaded a flood hazard mitigation working group in the area, focusing on the Sharon-Dakin area flood assessment and remediation initiative, the Town of Olive Flood Advisory Committee. Little known fact, my grandmother was born in the town of Olive. And in addition to his work with these groups, he's assisted in climate smart community programming and climate smart resiliency planning tools and assessments in communities throughout his service area. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to our speakers and we'll get going on the presentation. I think Brent's going to control the slides. So you're going to be kicking it off, Brent?
Yes, sir, I am. Give me a second to bring up the PowerPoint. And you guys can mute yourselves just so we don't get feedback. I appreciate it. Thank you. Give me one sec. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that okay. So thank you, Mark, for that great introduction. For the record, my last name is pronounced Goach, but that's quite all right. Everybody butchers it, and it's a very unusual name, so I don't blame you one bit. And again, thank you for the great introduction. So today we're going to be talking about land use strategies for flood resilience. And as John mentioned, myself, John, and Janet are all intimately involved in the New York State Floodplain Stormwater Managers Association. So just to go over briefly what we'll be talking about today, I'm going to start off by giving you some background information on general floodplain management. Then I'll pass it over to Janet, who will talk about land use planning. We'll then transition over to John, who will talk about land use regulations. And then I'll wrap up with providing you some additional resources from the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association. So the New York State Floodplain and Stormwater Managers Association is an organization of multiple professions working together to make New York State safer, more flood resilient, and better prepared for flood risks facing the state. And we really are a diverse organization made up of multiple professionals. As we mentioned before, we have planners, we have engineers involved, we have education outreach specialists, surveyors. I'm sure there's many others that I'm forgetting, but all these, in many ways, disparate, but also, collegial groups come together to try to help, help the state be more resilient in the face of flooding and also be better prepared with stormwater management. And we do this through several avenues. We provide training, which I'll save that for a little bit later. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail towards the end of the presentation. We also are an advocacy organization. We advocate for good, solid science-based and evidence-based floodplain management policies. And we have position papers and we write letters to elected officials to encourage them to promote policies that lead to good floodplain management. We do outreach similar to what we're doing today with you folks, with other organizations to talk about why this is an important issue and why it's something that should really be on everybody's radar. And then finally, we collaborate with, again, many different organizations, many different groups of people, again, all with the eye towards making sure that the state is resilient in the face of increasing flood risks. So why do we do what we do? Well, first and foremost, flooding is the most common and expensive disaster in New York State. It's actually the most common disaster in the entire country. I like to say, I think, the wildfires out west, the tornadoes and Tornado Alley, earthquakes. Those are kind of the sexy disasters. They get a lot of the press out there. But flooding, again, far and away the most common natural disaster you're going to face anywhere in the United States, and particularly in New York State. We have in our inland areas, particularly upstate, we have lots of rivers and streams which can flood periodically. Along our coastal areas, in the Great Lakes area, along Long Island, we have coastal issues. So New York State has a lot of flood hazards that it can experience. Furthermore, every county in New York State has had at least one declared flood disaster within the last decade. And in fact, several of them have had two or more. So this is not something that's on the periphery of the New York State experience. It's something that's really front and center. And it's something that, again, all the collaborative organizations that we work with, we really try to hammer this home. This is something that we deal with, almost on a daily basis for the mitigation measures that we take. And also, just trying to, make people aware of the risks that are associated with flooding. And there's several reasons why, New York State is, a prime target for flood disasters. And one is changing weather patterns due to climate change. We have increased precipitation events, greater hurricanes. You have this large storms that are dropping larger levels of precipitation all at once, which is swelling our rivers and streams, causing inundation, but also development. That's really what we're going to talk about today. We've developed a lot of our floodplain areas to include, our built infrastructure, homes, businesses, road stream crossings, all sorts of stuff is put into the floodplain. And that's, one of the reasons why it's such a problem here in New York and many places around the country, in the Northeast in particular. We have a lot of our built environment in the floodplain. And flood insurance rates are also going up. We're not going to be talking in great detail about flood insurance today, but we'll simply state that because of the increased risk, we're seeing larger and larger premiums for flood insurance policyholders as time goes on. And this could potentially depress the real estate market, particularly in floodplain areas or at least areas that are close to floodplain as well. So the National Climatic Data Center says that the Northeast, of which New York is one of the northeastern states, is expected to experience a 71% increase in very heavy precipitation events. And again, that's a result of climate change. We're having increased hurricanes, these larger category of hurricanes dumping precipitation on us. You also have rain on snowmelt events, in the winter and early spring months that are causing these sorts of things. Heavy thunderstorms even in the summer. Again, these increased precipitation events are really swelling our rivers and streams and making these flood events more frequent and common. I want to read you the quote at the bottom of the screen there. Floods are an act of God, but flood losses are largely an act of man. So Gilbert White is considered the father of modern floodplain management. And what he means by this is that flooding is a natural phenomenon. It's something that has, it's a very natural thing that has to deal with the life cycle of the streams. And we can't stop it, nor should we, if we are able to. Again, it's all part of this natural, hydrologic cycle that the earth experiences. But the losses, that's totally on us because we have chosen to put our development into our floodplain areas. Now, we can't go back in time and tell all the folks in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries to, not build our built environment in our floodplains. We can only go forward. But we do go forward, we need to make sure that we make good land use decisions. And that's something we'll be talking about as the presentation goes on. So I want to draw your attention to the chart here. This is annual flood losses from 1960 to 2018. Since 1960, losses have averaged nearly $10 billion per year in flood losses. And since the 1960s, the per person annual losses have increased by a factor of more than 6. In the 1960s, it cost each individual person roughly $8.90 per flood to take care of flood losses. In the 2010s, that had risen to $53.70. So this is a very significant increase, that percentage of flood losses. And again, why is this? This has to do with, again, the more severe storms and the development patterns, the increasing development pressures that we're facing. Tends to put a lot of our built infrastructure in that nice, flat, developable land, which tends to often be floodplains, riverfront property, waterfront property. As many of you know, that's very expensive property. That's where developers want to build. That's where you make a lot of profit. I'll just draw your attention really quickly to the graph here. You'll notice in 2005, that really big bar, that's Hurricane Katrina. I'm sure I don't have to tell you about that. Most of you are aware of it, but the city of New Orleans, right? That's in a floodplain. It's actually in a bowl that's below sea level. So when those levees and flood walls fail from that storm surge, that water just gets right in there and damages that built environment. That's one of the reasons why that's so, that was so destructive and has so many losses. I also want to bring your attention over to 2017. You'll see there, that is a result of Hurricane Harvey. And Hurricane Harvey affected a large area, but particularly the city of Houston. For those of you who are not familiar with Houston, Texas, it's very famous for not having any zoning. It also has very relatively lax land use regulations. So it was a rapidly growing city in the 90s, 20 aughts to 2010s. And people were building kind of wherever they could, oftentimes in floodplain areas, oftentimes in places that were set aside for stormwater management. So when you develop these areas, put all that impervious surface in one place, that potentially leads to losses. And that's why you see such a large, large loss right there. So again, just two poster childs for why you need to have good land use regulations when it comes to floodplain management considerations. So this slide here is all about the National Flood Insurance Program. And I think I can speak for both Jen and John saying that we've done presentations that take, multiple slides over multiple hours about the NFIP. So we're not really going to do it justice in one slide, but we'll give you the basics of it right here. So the NFIP, or the National Flood Insurance Program, was created in 1968 through the National Flood Insurance Act of 1968. And there's been additional legislation that's amended it over the years, the most recent being in 2014. And this is a program for communities who choose to participate. And by the way, this is all voluntary. If communities choose to participate, they can get access to relatively low cost NFIP flood insurance. I say relatively low cost because, as we mentioned earlier, flood insurance rates are getting more and more as time goes on. It's becoming increasingly unaffordable to the average home or structure owner. But be that as it may, it's still probably the most affordable options on the market. There are private flood insurances out there, but they, again, they're a little bit few and far between, but they're becoming more and more common. So we'll see how that develops as time goes on. And again, I'll just mention, this is a question I get a lot. Individuals do not participate in the National Flood Insurance Program. It's the local forms of government. So in New York State, as we all know, that's your town, your village, and your city levels of government. So as municipalities, if they choose to participate in the program, they get several benefits. One of them being, again, the NFIP flood insurance, and also access to certain types of disaster relief. So the NFIP establishes floodplain management standards that communities who participate in the program have to enforce in order to stay in compliance. That usually consists of building standards. The whole idea behind this is to reduce damage to loss of property and loss of life. And that usually includes elevation in the case of residential structures. That's building the homes up on piles, piers, posts, or columns, things you might see on beachfront property, or even elevated basement walls with flood vents to allow water to pass through, keeps those hydrostatic forces at bay, so you don't have buckling of foundation walls and things like that. If you have a non-residential structure, so think commercial buildings, industrial buildings, you can flood-proof them. That's basically making the building watertight using special sealants, special materials. So by doing that, that's one of the regulations that the NFIP enforces for structures that are newly built in the floodplain. There's also substantial damage and substantial improvement regulations that folks have to follow. Substantial damage simply means that if a structure is damaged by 51% or more of its value and it's located in a floodplain, then it has to be brought up into compliance, either through elevation or floodproofing. Substantial improvement is basically the flip side of that coin. If you're doing renovations, additions, et cetera, to an existing structure in a floodplain, if you increase the value by 51% or more, then you're going to have to, again, bring that building into compliance, usually through elevation or floodproofing. So the Federal Emergency Management Agency, or FEMA, that's the agency that oversees the NFIP. As we mentioned before, it provides access to the flood insurance. It also creates these things called flood insurance rate maps. Colloquially, a lot of people just call them flood maps or flood hazard maps. But these are the areas that map the extensive floodplains in a particular area, a particular municipality. Keep in mind, though, however, there's really no way for FEMA to map every potential flood source out there. And roughly 20% of all flood losses occur outside of a mapped FEMA flood area. I mean, again, depending upon how old your maps are, if they're more recent, they're probably more accurate. If they're older, I mean, there are many communities I know that I've worked with until recently that had maps from the 80s or even the 90s. Things change, development patterns change. We said before, weather patterns are changing. So those floodplain boundaries can shift as well. And sometimes they can shrink. It all kind of depends upon the modeling. And FEMA also provides grants for disaster relief as well. And so just to wrap up on this slide, there's a mandatory purchase requirement for flood insurance. So in 1973, the Flood Disaster Protection Act required that all federally backed mortgage holders purchase flood insurance for the life of a mortgage for structures that are located in a FEMA map floodplain. And this is really the thing that got a lot of communities invested in the National Flood Insurance Program. So essentially what happens is this: if you're purchasing property and you need to get a federal loan, so like a federally backed mortgage, which is what most mortgages in this country are, you are required by law to carry a FEMA flood insurance, or not even FEMA, you're required to carry a flood insurance policy for the life of that loan. Once the loan is paid off, you don't have to have flood insurance anymore. But again, to have access to that flood insurance, that's what gets most communities to participate in the NFIP, and they have to adhere to those regulations. So as we mentioned before, FEMA provides flood insurance. They also make these fancy flood insurance rate maps. There's an example of one on the right-hand side right there. We don't have time to go into all the intricacies of the flood maps, but you'll notice the kind of the turquoisey blue area, that's known as the special flood hazard area, or oftentimes more commonly the 100-year floodplain. That is simply, the mapped floodplain extent, that they have on the map there. And so the flood hazard maps or flood insurance rate maps, as we mentioned before, they map the 1% annual chance or 100-year floodplain. We try to get away from the term 100-year flood simply because I think it confuses a lot of folks. I'll give you a quick story. So in my hometown where I grew up, the last big, what we would probably consider 100-year flood occurred in 1928. My grandfather was a very little boy at the time, but he remembers it vividly because it basically wiped out the whole town. So when I talk to some of the old timers in the community, they always say, oh, we don't have to worry about a 100-year flood, not until 2028. And I always tell people, well, 2028, number one, is not that far away, but that's actually has nothing to do with it. This is really talking about statistical probability. A 100-year flood has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. So essentially every year that rolls up, you roll your dice and you see kind of what happens, right? You can have a 100-year, quote unquote, 100-year flood happen multiple times in a given year over several years back to back. Again, this is simply a way of talking about probability. So the term that floodplain managers like myself, Janet, and John like to use is 1% annual chance. This, I think, it gets the point across a little bit more. The thing about these maps, though, is they show the extent of the floodplain in the mapped areas, but they don't show runoff from new development. So if you have a new development that goes in, you have lots of impervious surface. That water can't infiltrate into the ground. It runs right off into the rivers and streams and can cause inundation in those areas. Doesn't really show ditches or debris blockages on those road stream crossings. I know in the area that I work, we have a lot of undersized bridges and culverts, ditches that get clogged up with debris. That can cause flooding and backwatering effect at those locations. Doesn't show erosion either. You see that bottom photo right there. I'm sure many of you have seen examples of that in your local communities where the velocities of the floodwaters are so great it takes out roads, and even how homes they're now hanging precipitously over stream banks because of the erosion. And again, with the kind of the specter of climate change around us, we're having larger and larger storms, heavier precipitation events. We're going to be seeing these sorts of events more and more as time goes on in this century. And then floodplain development standards, as we said before, their whole purpose of them is to reduce vulnerability to flooding and also reduce damage to other properties around them. Again, they don't account for things like erosion. They also don't account for sedimentation. So if you see that middle photo right there, this is a relatively small stream. You had a large storm event kind of localized in that area, and it washed all that sediment into the home there. Rivers and streams don't just move water, they move sediment as well. Everything from small, sandy, silty particles, gravel and cobble-sized particle, all the way up to boulders the size of Volkswagens. And believe me, I've seen this in my location. Depending upon the velocities of the water, you can move some pretty big material. And you can have situations like this where large amounts of sediment can move in and impact structures as well. But again, the whole purpose behind all of this is to make is for safety, right? Safety for human life and also for the properties that are affected by them. So I'm going to now turn it over to Janet, who's going to take you through the next few slides. Janet, take it away.
Thanks, Brent. So floodplain managers need planners. Brent talked about the floodplain development standards. They specify how we build in floodplains and not whether those are good places to put our development in the first place. And that's why we continue to see increases in the number of buildings in the floodplain, which contributes to increases in flood damage and also increased risks for health and safety when people are in unsafe locations. Local municipalities have other land use authorities that we can use to manage the allowed uses in flood-prone areas, the densities in these areas. We can manage uses outside of the FEMA mapped floodplains and incorporate flood risks into what's allowed in those areas as well. And if we're going to effectively manage flood risk, we also need to be addressing the natural resources and protecting those features that help to mitigate flooding. When we have trees and vegetation and wetlands in the upland areas away from our streams, those are often holding back water and taking the peak off of the downstream flooding. Also, the vegetation and wetlands located in the floodplains slows down those out of bank flows and takes the pressure off downstream areas. So we need to be protecting those natural resources. And your job as planners is to promote responsible growth and development. And so we're hoping to share some strategies and ideas because we want to help you help us and try to avoid that poor development decisions that will lead to flooded development down the road. The next slide. So government has an affirmative duty to prevent harm. The most important reason that local governments exist is to protect health, safety, and welfare. This sometimes gets sidelined because we're focused on potholes or assessments or whatever the hot issue is at the moment, but we shouldn't lose sight of the issues that relate to safety. And if it rains in your community, then those safety considerations should include integrating flood concerns into local plans, into your policies, practices, any regulations you have, any investment decisions. And by addressing flood resilience, we're improving safety, but we're also saving money in the long run. So that's also part of your fiscal responsibilities for protecting both public and private investments. Next slide. So what tools can we use to reduce flood damage and also to protect beneficial natural features? Brent talked about the minimum standards for floodplain development that are in our local laws. Each municipality that participates in the program has a local law, and those standards are also in the building code. That's really important, but it's only a start because those are standards for high-risk areas, and they're minimum standards. We also do a lot of planning at the local level, and we have local responsibility for land use as far as regulations. Hazard mitigation plans are intended to address flooding along with other hazards. In New York State, they encourage multi-jurisdictional plans developed by counties. And those are typically focused on how do we reduce risks for existing development. But they should also include some forward-looking ideas and strategies for how do we prevent future high-risk development. So we should be integrating our county mitigation plans with the municipal planning that we do and the land use authorities for protecting future development. So at the local level, communities develop and adopt comprehensive plans. In theory, we update them every 5 years. I know that's not the case, but that's the ideal place for addressing flood hazards. It's a statement of the community's vision. It presents goals and objectives and policies for achieving that vision. So when we're developing a comprehensive plan, this is a perfect opportunity for considering what are our local flood risks and what are the best strategies for reducing those risks in our particular situation. Another useful local plan is a disaster recovery plan. This would be a strategy for building back safer and stronger. Because after a disaster, community needs to quickly make decisions about are there areas where we can just allow repair without any delay? And are there other areas that are not safe for occupation and that should never be rebuilt? And are there areas that can be rebuilt, but maybe we should be including additional retrofitting techniques in that rebuilding process? So most communities don't develop a recovery plan before a disaster, which is the ideal time when you have time to think these things through. But preliminary discussion of these issues can be included in the comprehensive plan. And ideally, a community's hazards and safety concerns should be integrated into any plan that relates to land use patterns, economic development plans, infrastructure or planning, watershed planning, and other things. And municipal authorities then allow community, based on their comprehensive plan, to adopt regulations. We want to proactively manage those land use patterns. And objectives of those regulations should include directing intensive and vulnerable uses away from high hazard areas, be the hazards flooding or landslides or other things, and also protecting the beneficial natural features that reduce the magnitude of those hazards. For the next slide. So scope and the detail and comprehensive plans varies widely, but these are the basic functions of the plan. Comprehensive plan should identify and document the community's desires. How do they relate to, what are their concerns about a wide variety of local issues? Listed a few of them there. We should be sure that flood safety is included in those issues that are addressed in the plan. Once a comprehensive plan is adopted by the local governing body, it becomes a blueprint for developing or revising any land use regulations. So it is a legal document. It's the basis that supports land use regulations. It's required in New York State for adoption of zoning laws. The comprehensive plan itself isn't directly enforceable for individual land use actions. It's the foundation that we use to build on. Next slide. We, of course, all want our communities to be safe and sustainable. So the comprehensive plans should include a roadmap for promoting safe development practices and patterns. And there's a list of a few principles to keep in mind as we're going through the planning process. As Brent said, flooding doesn't stop at the flood zone boundary. And some of the variables that affect flood risks include runoff from development. Roads and buildings typically alter drainage patterns. They reduce the area where soil can soak into the rainwater. And if these changes aren't managed properly, which they often weren't before we implemented stormwater management requirements, and still may not be for development that's not subject to those permit requirements. If the runoff isn't managed properly, more will leave the site, contributing to flooding, often erosion as well. Another issue is the loss of natural features. Forests on the hills slow down water. They use that water. They hold the soil in place. Vegetation on the floodplain serves similar functions in relation to the high flows from the stream channel. When we lose those natural features, we lose some of the flood protection benefits they provide. So as planners, we need to preserve, if not the features themselves, definitely the functions that they serve, ways that they help us. In that picture, you can see that the water's higher on the wrong side of that levee. That's in the city of Hornell in 1972. This happened because there was so much runoff rushing down that hillside. I don't know if they had logged it before then or if that was just a natural occurrence. So resilience includes flooding is going to happen. We're not going to stop all flooding, and we're not going to keep all development out of flood-prone areas. So we also need to have flood warnings and emergency response activities. Local awareness of flood conditions with good flood warnings provides valuable time that we need to use for evacuations, road closures, and any other actions that will save lives and prevent damage. And every community and every business as well really should have an up-to-date emergency response plan that spells out who is responsible and what needs to be done before, during, and after a flood or another emergency. Those plans should have some information specific to flooding, because our warnings for flooding are different than other emergencies. The locations of flooding are often known. So we should really be targeting our flood risks, in particular in our emergency response planning. Next. Another good principle to keep in mind is called no adverse impact. This was developed by the Association of State Floodplain Managers. It's the principle that it's not okay for the actions of one property owner to cause any adverse impact on other property owners. So you shouldn't allow activities that are going to increase flood heights or increase flood velocities for neighboring properties. So when you're approving development, you not only need to think about how will that development be protected from the flood risks at that site, but also is there potential for them to adversely affect their neighbors. So it's a two-stage process. One is to try to identify the impacts, and that's easier said than done. It depends on the quality of our modeling and the local expertise about drainage and flooding issues. And the other is to either prevent or mitigate those impacts so that neighbors aren't harmed. Doesn't mean that you don't allow the proposed project, but when you allow it, you make sure that it doesn't harm the neighbors. Next. Back to comprehensive planning. Opportunities to address flood risk during each step of the process. Planning always starts with fact finding, or good planning does. So this is an opportunity to document existing conditions, future trends, potential problems, any other particular community concerns. And then the planning committee will incorporate this data and the public input to develop goals and objectives. Flood risk need to be considered in conjunction with a lot of other concerns in the community. So it's challenging to strike a balance between a lot of different issues. They may conflict, and also diverse viewpoints within your residents. But in that complicated process of balancing issues and needs, just don't let safety and flooding fall off the table completely. Plan will articulate a policy with identifying the appropriate tools for achieving the community's objectives. These can include, excuse me, capital projects, development guidelines, operating procedures, and also land use regulations, which John will be talking about in more detail later. And plans are supposed to be implemented. If you've put flood resilience items into your plan, you hope to implement those before the flood, not after. And it needs to be reviewed and updated periodically. Next. So the data collection and mapping for comprehensive plan will include a lot of topics. But if flood risks aren't identified, if they aren't mapped, then I can pretty much guarantee that they also won't be addressed in your goals, objectives, and recommendations. So basic layer would be the FEMA mapped floodplain. It seems basic, but I've reviewed a lot of comprehensive plans, and many with fairly significant flood risks haven't thought to include this. They were focused on other issues. And also put onto your maps the floodway. In coastal areas, there may be coastal barrier resource system areas, COBRA areas, otherwise protected areas. There may be additional areas where flood-related development restrictions may be in place. Some FEMA maps show 500-year floodplains. We don't or the 2% annual probability floodplain, as Brent said, that would be our preferred terminology. We don't typically regulate development to flood standards in these floodplains, but it's important to map them, to think about the risks there, and to consider whether additional land use restrictions may be warranted due to those flood risks. And because the floods don't read the maps, any additional information we have about areas that have flooded in the past, areas with erosion, flash flooding, drainage problems, we may not have detail that's actionable to support regulations, but we should be identifying those locations, those issues, putting them on a maps when we can, just so we have that information to build on. Flood insurance data provides information about the severity of prior flood damages in the claims data, and also just to what extent are future flood losses likely to be covered by insurance. That is an important consideration in the flood recovery, is how many people have flood insurance to help with that rebuilding, and how many people have chosen not to purchase it for whatever reason. Drainage infrastructure includes bridges, culverts, stormwater practices. Flood control levees are important infrastructure. They're often not included in the comprehensive plan because they're there, they protect us. We assume they always will protect us. But we know from experience in other parts of the country that sometimes they're overtopped, sometimes they fail. That 1935 flood, that community had flood control levees built to protect it not long after that flood. They hope it will never again flood their main street like that, but the risk isn't zero. So the Corps of Engineers has a national levee database, and their website, you can access mapping of the areas that are protected by flood control levees in that system. So that's also useful information to include in your comprehensive plan. Dams as well. If there are any dams in your community or upstream, where are they? And also, is there publicly available information about areas that could flood if the dam overtops or fails? We may want to try to limit development downstream of dams that are currently classified as low hazard dams, because we don't want to put people at risk. We don't want them to become high hazard dams. Next. Natural features are also important, and more often we do include most of these things in a comprehensive plan. But there are additional hints of areas that may be prone to flooding, particularly if we get into streams that may not have mapped floodplains, wetland areas. So we obviously want to map lakes, rivers, streams. We also want to think about mapping areas where we're getting flood protection benefits, either undeveloped floodplains, riparian buffers that are slowing and storing floodwater and benefiting the rest of the community. Highlight those. Slopes are important. We should identify areas with 15 or 25% or greater slopes. When we develop or harvest timber on these areas, those projects should receive extra attention, because uncontrolled water goes down the hills quickly, often causes erosion, flash flooding if it's not managed appropriately. Should identify sensitive groundwater resources. Sometimes the areas that we warrant special protection for wellhead protection purposes, source water protection purposes, may be the same as the areas that warrant special protection because of the flood risks also. Parks, trails, ball fields, recreation areas. These are generally great uses for flood-prone lands. So while we're discussing areas that are unsuitable for other types of development, we should also be discussing what are our recreational needs, and can those be met in our flood-prone areas. Next. Public engagement is essential for developing a good comprehensive plan. We should also include anybody who may have a role in implementing the plan's recommendations, get them involved in crafting the plan. If there hasn't been a recent flood, flooding may not be on the radar of community officials or the planning committee. Public may not think to put their flood concerns into the survey you send out, but that doesn't mean that you shouldn't address it, because local government's responsible for public safety, even when residents are blissfully unaware of the risks, and even when residents really don't understand strategies for minimizing those risks. So to get buy-in for any strong flood resilience measures you want to take, you'll first need to think about educating the community, both the public and community officials, about the issues. When you do that, use lay terms, focus on the big issues, don't get bogged down in technical details, save those for offline moments when you have limited time with the public. So focus on what the risks of flooding are local to your community, what's the potential for flood damage, are there safety issues, are there roads that are particularly prone to washing out, and what are the key strategies for managing those risks. And use maps. You know, when data information's on a map, people see it. They're more likely to think about it. In this picture, the map on the wall in Town Hall shows the FEMA mapped floodplains. So that's there to remind people whenever they walk into the building department that floodplains and flood hazards are a real part of this community and significant to the things that we do there. Historic flood photos are great if you have them. We all see flood pictures on the news all the time, but that news is usually about somewhere else. Local flood pictures serve as a reminder that this hazard also exists in our own communities. And stress safety issues. It's the civic duty of local governments to protect health, safety, and welfare. People understand this, and so they're more likely to support resilience recommendations if those recommendations are clearly tied to safety and preventing property damage. You don't ever want to give the impression that the only reason your community is interested in protecting natural features is because you happen to like fish more than you like people. I wish I had never heard that comment, but it's sometimes the public perception that people get. Next. So we've identified our hazards, we've involved the public, hopefully we've educated the public. So what are we going to do about it? I like to organize the flood resilience strategies into these 4 buckets. Your planning committee may not have the technical expertise to really develop great strategies. So invite soil and water districts, invite emergency management, invite other subject water experts to help you with figuring out what to do about your flood risks and what makes sense for your particular location. So the first strategy is to manage water where it falls, promote stormwater management and green infrastructure practices, maintain those once they're installed, and pay special attention to runoff and erosion on steep slopes. You want to manage runoff near where the rain falls, and you want to manage it in a way that prevents any adverse impacts to neighbors and downstream areas. Make room for water. When we get more water than fits in a stream or river channel or the normal water level of a lake, or we will have flooding. It's natural. We need to anticipate that and set aside those highest risk areas. So some communities will apply the approach of keeping an area free from development because it's unsafe. They may apply this to the mapped floodplain, the entire mapped floodplain. They may apply it to the floodway or other high-risk parts of the floodplain. They may establish stream setback requirements, require riparian buffers along streams, various tools and ways to encourage development outside of our high-risk areas. We want to promote. Another way to do that is to put a park there or trails. Once we use those areas for recreation, there isn't pressure to use them for more intensive development. And then we have to live with flooding. We're not going to keep all of our flood-prone areas free of development. So our comprehensive plan should include recommendations how we're going to enhance safety and reduce potential damages in those areas where we do develop, even though there is some amount of flood risk. So this includes definitely includes flood control infrastructure, stream management, roadway drainage management, emergency response planning, flood warnings, a number of different approaches that we combine to make our communities safer. And we always need to continue to educate the public. It's a community-wide endeavor. Most of our flood risks occur on private property. So we need well-informed people who can make better decisions to protect themselves, their property, and their neighbors. But it's a tough balance. How do we balance these risks and these ideal things to do to address these risks with other concerns in the community? We have economic, environmental, and social concerns that need to be balanced, and that's the difficult job that falls to you planners to try to coordinate and facilitate those decisions. One more slide. So the community strategy that's presented in a comprehensive plan generally consists of a vision statement, goals, objectives, and recommendations for implementing actions. The vision statement is the foundation for the entire plan, so don't forget to include safety. Example of phrases that could be included are simply the word safe, instead of just saying we want a vibrant community, we want a safe, vibrant community. Protect life and property. Floodplains are meant to flood, make room for water. Some short statements that can be included in that vision. Goals and objectives are an opportunity to aim high, be aspirational. In relation to flood risks, the plan should definitely identify high-risk areas and make recommendations for keeping some of those highest risk areas free from development. Should include goals for protecting natural features that help to reduce flood damage. And it's really helpful to prepare a future land use map. Think about, if we don't want development in our high-risk areas, where do we want it? And what kinds of development and what densities of development are most appropriate in different parts of our community, given both what we have there now and what our natural resources and our natural issues are. And then the comprehensive plan develops recommendations. These should be achievable, and those can include regulations, municipal operations, outreach, funding needs, whatever approaches the community chooses to address, to adjust their vision and their goals and objectives. So with that, I will turn it over to John to talk to us about land use regulations.
Thank you, Janet. So land use regulations, through power, these are the tools that communities have at their disposal, as part of the development review and the overall planning process. The big item on this is, through these regulations, you are regulating whether it's different uses or the individual districts. But the big reason for these regulations overall, especially when you're dealing with floodplain management, is for public safety. And sometimes that gets missed a lot when, trying to explain that to the public, that, these rules and requirements are in place, for their benefit. And, making that known is, very crucial, throughout any process. As everybody already knows, New York is a home rule state. So local governments have the authority, over, property affairs of government. They also they're able to place restrictions upon different types of uses throughout the communities. And that's something that I'll get into at the latter part of the presentation. Getting back to the police power that communities have at their disposal, this has been defined generally as the power to regulate persons and property for the purpose of securing the public health, safety, welfare, comfort, peace, and prosperity of the municipality and its inhabitants. Next slide, please. So local land use regulations, and these three are examples of land use regulations that communities have at their disposal. Depending on your community, these could all be standalone sections of your municipal ordinance, or they can be all packaged into one. For example, the town of Greece, which I'm employed by, our zoning ordinance, while it regulates and outlines districts and permitted uses, it also does include, as part of its development review sections, the requirements for subdivision and site plan review. So every community across New York State is going to be different on how these regulations are outlined and implemented. Next slide, please. So the main tool that we have at disposal is zoning. And, as many of you are already aware, zoning is the way in which land in a municipality is used and developed. It outlines what can be done in certain zoning districts, as well as having bulk requirements in terms of density and setback. And the goal of zoning is really to carry out the municipality's long-range land use objectives, whether it's recommended or outlined in a comprehensive plan. And zoning is a tool that courts have supported over time, going back to the 1920s in the Ambler Realty versus Village of Euclid, Ohio case. The courts have said that communities have the authority to use zoning from a land use perspective, in their individual communities. Next slide, please. So in terms of zoning examples, every community is going to be different. Some communities will utilize certain, regulations in their zoning ordinance. And, to the left of the screen is just a list of a few that certain communities will have at their disposal. Some can be incentive zoning, the use of overlays, floating zones, or planned unit developments or PUDs. So every community is going to be different on how they implement zoning and how it's utilized. Next slide, please. So one example could be the use of whether it's a flood or floodplain zoning district. And the map to the bottom right of the screen, I believe, is from the town of Big Flats. And that dark green color that kind of follows the meander of the stream is a floodplain zoning district. So, in one of those zoning districts, you can implement density controls whether it's the size of the lots that you allow there, or if you allow a number of units in that individual district. You could allow uses that are compatible with flood risk, such as maybe uses that are dependent on water, maybe marinas or recreational uses. You could allow strictly open space uses or conservation uses where maybe, those areas are not allowed to be developed, whether it's the use of deed restrictions or conservation easements or, something along those lines. So these are, like I said, different tools that communities can use from a zoning standpoint to implement floodplain management techniques. Next slide, please. So this example is from the town of Wheatland and the village of Scottsville, which is in Monroe County. And this community contains Owaka Creek, which runs from the western portion of the town flowing east, eventually into the Genesee River. And if you can see on the map, that orange shade with the hatched black lines, that is their flood hazard district, which falls in residential areas of the town. Pretty much it's utilized to regulate vulnerable areas to flooding. So for permitted uses, it allows agriculture, playgrounds and recreation areas, the type of low intensity uses that you would envision being in a floodplain or a flood prone area. You do not want high density residential or commercial where they could be at, they can run into issues down the road if, a serious event was to occur. In the town of Wheatland, they also allow special exception uses, which are private recreation areas, nonprofit membership clubs. So, like I said, low intensity uses that, if a flooding event was to occur, there wouldn't be significant loss of, property or individuals. Next slide, please. This is an example from the town of Southport, and in This example, if you can see it on the map, it might be a little hard to see, but you kind of see these blue dots. That is the town's conservation district. And that district supports low intensity recreational and agricultural uses that are compatible with flood hazard and do not require the construction of new buildings. Buildings are prohibited except for small structures on parcels larger than 10 acres that are necessary appurtenance for the agricultural, recreational, or open space use, such as a restroom or shed, or, like I said, low intensity. Recreational vehicles, trailers, and portable toilets must be adequately anchored to resist flotation. Open pavilions are not considered buildings and are thus permitting. Filling, storage, pavement, and other encroachments, natural drainage and flood flows are prohibited in this conservation district. So you're really trying to minimize impacts and minimize loss of property or, individuals in these districts. Next slide, please. Special permits to be known as use permits or conditional permits. Every municipality has them outlined a little differently or refers them a little differently, but they're a flexible technique for allowing municipality to review a proposed development project in order to assure that a project is in harmony with the zoning and will not adversely affect the neighborhood or the adjoining areas. In most municipal zoning regulations, many uses are permitted within a zoning district as of outright, with no discretionary review of the proposed project. Certain uses, on the other hand, require closer examination based on special review standards. A use may be allowed through a special use permit by using standards set forth in the zoning regulations. And this could be, a type of use of maybe it is a higher intensity where it will generate additional traffic to a certain area, or it will produce a lot of noise, or, since we are talking about floodplain management, it could be a use that is more intensity that will lead to, more structures being located within the floodplain. So, once again, it's just another tool that communities can have at their disposal to regulate development in the floodplain or these flood prone areas. Next slide. Overlaying zoning. A lot of communities, especially in rural areas, utilize overlaying zonings. Districts, a lot of times you'll see them in the forms of EPADs or environmental protection and overlay districts. This is something a community could use, whether you have, riparian areas of the communities or just in general, flood prone areas of the communities where you have these overlay zonings where, you have underlying uses that could be allowed, whether it's, single family homes or recreational activities. But with these overlaying zoning districts, it allows, whether it's additional restrictions or requirements, it can just be another tool that can be utilized by the community to control development in the floodplain. And, as Janet alluded to, not creating any adverse impact to whether it's adjoining properties or adjoining areas of the municipality. Next slide, please. And this is just an example, if you were to have an overlay district such as an EPOD, you might want it to be set up where you require green infrastructure or low impact development techniques to minimize any impact to adjoining areas, whether it's, avoiding disturbance of a stream bed that might, allow for additional runoff or increase the flow of a stream where it could impact downstream areas. You could reduce the impervious cover by, utilizing green infrastructure techniques to control runoff. So you don't have sheet flow, say, across a parking lot that could eventually go into, single family homes or multifamily complexes or even commercial buildings, especially if you have a tight, compact Main Street area of a town. And the big thing is you're managing the development. You're not saying development can occur, but you want to manage it in a way where it doesn't impact those adjoining areas. Next slide, please. Incentive zoning, and this is another item that some communities have at their disposal, some don't. I believe in Monroe County, I know of 2 communities that have incentive zoning on their books. But like I said, every community is different. And, incentive zoning could be a good tool to utilize, to control development in the floodplain where maybe on a project, you allow maybe a higher density of residential or commercial uses, but in return, you receive, a certain area of that development to be set aside for floodplain management, storage, or, conservation purposes. So, this is just another tool that communities could utilize to control the development in the floodplain and not cause any of those impacts that could be seen, during or after a severe event. Next slide, please. So on this map, this is a section of map for the city of Kingston, down on the Hudson River, just north of New York City. And if you look where it's, states, I believe it's Rondout Creek, apologize if I say it incorrectly, but that dark green is what's referred to as the Ron Creek zoning district. And that district allows for, as permitted uses, a lot of water dependent uses. So, wholesale and retail fish stores, marine type uses such as marinas or light assembly, but it also does allow through its incentives, restaurants, hotels, bed and breakfast, retail stores, as long as that those uses are able to provide, permanent access down to the shoreline of the creek. So, once again, it's, we have these listing of uses that are allowed as of right, but if these projects or, areas were to provide certain amenities like that access to the creek, then they would be permitted there. Next slide, please. And then floating zones is another tool that communities can use at their disposal. And pretty much what these are, as many of you already know, are zones where they're outlined in your zoning ordinance, you have requirements on them, but they don't show up on your zoning map. And a lot of times, they can only occur with whether it's a rezoning of a particular property. This could be utilized in a way where, if an individual wants to, develop a portion of property, maybe for mixed use, as part of that rezoning process and having that zone implemented, maybe they set aside a certain amount of land for floodplain management or conservation reasons, or for recreational reasons where there really isn't no serious impact to, the floodplain or adjoining areas. Next slide, please. And this map is from the town of Haverstraw, which I believe is down in Rockland County, just north of New York City. And they do have a floating zone implemented. And the town of Haverstraw is desirous of providing more flexible standards along the Route 202 corridor that will provide for a mix of land uses and foster new development in order to attract new businesses to bolster the tax base. The town of Haverstraw also recognizes the fact that there has been an increase in the senior population, specifically in the frail, elderly, and there's a need for housing to address the unique needs of this age group. Therefore, an assisted living residence has been added as a special permit use in the floating overlay zone. The purpose of this section is to encourage greater flexibility in future land use and to provide for the development of the uses included hereafter through the creation of a floating zone to be applied to properties along Route 202 with certain standards as provided herein. So, like I said before, it's once again another tool that communities have at their disposal and another way where you can allow for maybe additional uses that might not be already called out in your ordinance or as underlying permitted uses. Next slide, please. Planned unit developments, also known as PUDs. The PUD concept allows for a combination of land uses, such as a single and multiple residential, industrial, commercial on a single parcel of land. It also may allow a planned mix of building types and densities. And, similar to incentive zoning, a PUD could be utilized to, like I said, you allow for higher densities of residential, commercial, or industrial on a property, but in return, you can get areas of that property to be preserved for floodplain management or conservation purposes. This is one that, like I said, not many communities have. I know the town agrees. We have no PUDs in the town, but other communities do. I know the city of Rochester utilizes PUDs a lot in their land use regulations. Next slide, please. Transfer of development rights. This is another tool that you see, I believe, more predominantly in rural areas, or you see utilized a lot by a lot of local land trusts. But pretty much it's a way to transfer you're sending development rights from one parcel to another parcel. And like I said, a lot of times we'll see it in more rural areas. Not many communities do have it. Next slide, please. So this example is from the town of Smithtown, which is in Long Island. And pretty much Long Island sits atop 3 aquifers that are sole sources of drinking water for the island. To protect our drinking water from contamination, Suffolk County regulates the amount of wastewater that can be discharged on properties. In this area of the county, owners have the right to generate 300 gallons of wastewater per day per half acre. However, some owners would like to use their properties more intensely and others less intensely. In such cases, the county allows owners to transfer rights from one property to another. So once again, getting back to, what I just mentioned, that, you're giving rights that might not be already allowed on one property from another. Next slide, please. And then subdivision of land. This is a regulation that probably every community has in their ordinance. And, like the slide says, it's how is the land intended to be used, and to ensure that the, development of that land is going to occur, in an orderly pattern. A subdivision plat contemplates division of one tract into a number of smaller lots with eventual separate ownership of each lot. Before it can be conducting subdivision plat review, a municipality must define the term subdivision to establish the number of lots, blocks, or sites for which subdivision review will be required. And a lot of times for subdivisions, it will be a 2-step process. It will be, what's referred to as the preliminary plat, which, say you have 50 acres of land, it will show how that land will be developed. It will show the road layout and the geometry and the individual parcels that will be developed. And then you'll have your final plat for when, say, a developer is ready for construction, you'll have them come in for approvals for those individual sections. So it could be maybe a 1-section subdivision, it could be a 10-section subdivision, depending on how large of property that you have. Next slide, please. And then common subdivision standards. Every community is different, but there's a lot of items that you'll see on a subdivision map. And the items that are outlined in red are ones that you can consider more when it comes to floodplain management. The lot layout. Do you want to have lots that back up to say a stream, or do you want to have those maybe set aside as open space? Same thing with the street layout. Do you want to have streets in close proximity to a stream, or do you want to leave them maybe set back a little bit further, just so if there is a high water event or flooding, that there's no impact to EMS services or the individual property owners being able to enter and exit the street. So just all these items are just a bunch of things that we need to consider as part of the planning process, and planning boards have to look to when they do grant approvals for subdivisions. Next slide, please. Then cluster development or conservation subdivisions. Like I said before, some communities have these, some don't. But if your community doesn't have these, New York State town law does have requirements for cluster subdivisions if you were to implement it. And pretty much the purpose of these is to try to allow for the development of, certain areas or certain properties while maintaining, the environmental resources or flood prone areas of these properties. Every municipality is going to be unique on what their objective is, whether it's for open space that you would like to see as recreational uses, or if it's to conserve maybe riparian areas for floodplain reasons or storage. So every community will be different on how they utilize, this type of regulation if it's in your ordinance. I know for the town of Greece, we do have our own standalone cluster development subdivision requirements, which a lot of it is based on state town law, but we also have some additional requirements or items in it where it requires a concept level plan to be reviewed by the planning board before it could be even considered a cluster subdivision and for the project to move forward. You could also require that the number of lots that you would have on, say, a regular plan per your zoning ordinance, where, say, this 50-acre lot can be developed into 45 lots. Well, through the conservation process, you can't have any more lots than what your code would require. So, it could be a tool where you could allow for the density that might be needed on a development, but you could isolate those densities into certain areas while conserving, open space on a property. Next slide, please. And then procedures. As municipal planners, that's the one thing that we're kind of tied to. Making sure that we follow our procedures. If there was ever an instance where a decision was to be challenged, one of the first things attorneys are going to go and look at and say, did you follow your procedures, whether it's seeker or your local law. So, a wise developer would include due diligence in the development process, and the community subdivision process may include a step of a pre-sketch plan meeting. This can be a concept level plan meeting where, you have a developer come in front of your planning board or planning commission and say, before I make, full application, this is what I'm thinking in terms of the layout, and, what are your initial thoughts, or, to staff, what are your initial thoughts? So, it's a good way where you could potentially prevent any issues down the road in the early stage of a project. And then, much like the pre-sketch plan meeting, the submittal of a sketch plan may not be required as part of the subdivision review process. However, it can be very effective as a low-cost planning tool used by the developer in early meetings with community officials about the feasibility of the proposed project in conjunction with the community's regulations or requirement of design through the permitting process and on to implementation. Many of the facts and findings from the due diligence process are included in the sketch plan itself or are used in preparing the sketch plan. And then the preliminary plat should be used as a suitable scale with accurate drafting so that all the characters of the final plat can be anticipated. So, getting back to that preliminary plat, you want to see the road layout and the geometry. You want to see how utilities are going to be handled. You want to see how stormwater management is going to occur. All those, small items that get put together into an overall plan. And then the decision of the preliminary plat is most likely the important step taken by the planning board in the subdivision process. At this stage, the design features of the entire project are determined, and the planning board ensures that the adequate public facilities are available or will be available in the foreseeable future to serve the proposed development. So, getting back to what I said earlier about the preliminary plat, this is where you're really going to see how a piece of property can be developed at the early stage before a final plat and then the individual subdivision sections for constructions. So, this is the point to really dictate, is this particular property being utilized in the best way that it could be, whether it's from a zoning standpoint or any other regulatory standpoint. Next slide, please. And then locally adopted subdivision regulations for flood risks. And, these are just items to take into consideration when, you're reviewing and approving a subdivision plan. So, are there water bodies that are without identified floodplains? FEMA, when they put together their firm maps, they don't go and review every stream and creek in a community. I know, for example, in the town of Greece where I'm employed, we do have FEMA floodplain, but we also have areas that are severely flood prone that FEMA never mapped. And we have a study from the 1970s from the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers that we utilize for planning for a planning standpoint. And we also have adopted into our local code just because we had issues with developers wanting to put buildings in areas where they probably shouldn't have, just because they're in close proximity to a creek, or that creek was mapped by the Army Corps in the 70s, and it showed that this is a flood prone area with severe risk. The same thing can be, with dams and levees. If you're a community that is, built under a levee, deciding on having a subdivision directly under that, might not be the most ideal, or, the layout might not be the most ideal. So just items to take into consideration when you're reviewing and approving these projects. Next slide. And, getting back to subdivision, the layout and design is important, as well as the infrastructure. You're showing, where these items can and can't go, and, how would they interact with, the as-built environment, so for local road system, if you're in an area that is highly flood prone, maybe you want to design the geometry of the road network to try to avoid those areas. So it does allow for ingress and egress, for individual property owners in the event of an incident, or same thing with utilities. Having those in areas that are maybe above flood elevation or away from flood prone areas. So if flooding was to occur, the utilities aren't going to be damaged or compromised, or even just to maintain those utilities, they don't have to worry about high water levels when work would have to be performed. Next slide. So non-structural and structural, and these are getting into how we can develop these areas and different, items to consider. So, you can avoid land disturbance and pavement and other impervious areas adjacent to streams. You can ensure buildings are above the natural elevation, above the regulatory floodplain, or, you could even make sure that they're so far back from the floodplain. Your local ordinance could say, if you want to build a building, it has to be at least 50 or 100 feet from the special flood hazard area. Floodplains don't end, where the map says they end. You can still get possibilities of sheet flow and other items like that. And then in terms of structural, you can elevate road surfaces, you can size culverts approximately to handle that frequency of a 100-year event, or even upsize those culverts to handle the additional flow that they'll see in an event if it was to occur. Next slide, please. And then watershed management. This is something that can be utilized not by just one individual community, but by a grouping of communities. A lot of streams, creek, rivers, they don't just pass through one municipality. So, watershed management could be a tool that, say 5 communities decide to partner up through intermunicipal agreement and say, okay, anytime we have a development project that's going to occur in one of these watersheds, each community will have the ability to review that project and to provide comment on that project. In a watershed, every community's going to have a different view of it, whether you're upstream, downstream. So this can just be another tool that can be used at a comprehensive level to minimize impacts of up and downstream communities as it relates to development projects. Next slide, please. And then site plan review. This is the one that we deal with probably the most in the town of Greece, where you're going to get a component of zoning ordinances or separate enactments. But pretty much, you're reviewing the individual site and how it's going to be developed. If you're reviewing a site plan for a property that's in a flood-prone area or adjoining a FEMA floodplain, there are items that you want to make sure that are, implement or delineate on that drawing, or you want to discuss as part of the planning process. So, if there is a 100-year floodplain, you want to make sure you have those base flood elevations and that floodplain delineated. And from there, you can kind of mold the plan a little bit more by saying, okay, we know where those zones are. Now let's look at everything else. Does it make sense to have this underground parking facility in that area, or does it make sense to have buildings right on top of it? So, these are just tools to we can utilize to allow for development in these areas, but also to protect them from any significant events. Next slide. And like I mentioned before, it illustrates the intended design, arrangement, and the use of the lands to be improved. We'll describe the proposal's physical, social, and economic effects on the community. So, from the physical aspect, you'll have a change in a particular property. This could be a greenfield site that now is going to be redeveloped into a strip plaza. Or, from an economic standpoint, this could have been vacant land that maybe was assessed at a certain dollar amount as vacant land, but now that it's going to be developed, it's going to receive a different assessment where it provides tax base to the community. So just items to consider as part of the planning process. Next slide. And then, kind of tying it all together, whether it's site plan or subdivision, just typical development considerations. Means of access, where are your entry points? Are they off like a main thoroughfare, or are these off smaller subdivision roads? Landscaping, do you want to be filling and grading in areas, adjacent to floodplains, which could maybe impact runoff or increase the flow and velocity, where maybe you're sending additional water downstream? Buffers, do you want to have buildings setback, not just from property lines or asphalt, as many, zoning ordinances do, but do you want to have a requirement that says, in our community, you'll be at least, 50 feet or 100 feet away from the top bank of a stream, or, whatever, they decide is more appropriate. Architectural features, if you're in a flood prone area, do you want to have items in place such as vents or dry floods proofing? So if an event was to occur, that, buildings wouldn't be damaged, or there wouldn't be a loss of life, or, something along those lines. So, getting to the final bullet point, it all really comes down to, you're protecting the health, safety, and general welfare of the community. Next slide. And then review standards related to flood safety. These are just things that should be taken into consideration, as it relates to, development. So, the first step in reducing runoff is to avoid impacts to the site as much as possible by preserving natural features in undisturbed areas. So maybe instead of having, 50 spot parking lot with nothing but asphalt, but maybe you include some green infrastructure or rain gardens. So something where you're controlling runoff from going downstream or going into another area of a property or a community, but it's being contained and treated there. These are items that can be considered and, should be all taken into consideration, as best management procedures when, you're reviewing applications. Next slide. And then just architectural considerations and flood resiliency. At the planning level, you might not get too much into this. This could be, more for a building department, but something to consideration, because, if you are going to allow development in flood prone areas, you should be aware of the different regulations or the different standards that these homes or structures would have to be included to, whether it's providing the proper size flood openings on a foundation, or allowing, barriers around a structure in the case of a serious flood event, or flood resistant materials. So for example, if you're in an area where maybe you're close to a large water body like a lake or even the ocean down on Long Island, maybe you are aware that if you were to build a structure in that area, that maybe it needs to be built out on stilts with a breakaway foundation. So just items to take into consideration when, you're approving projects, but also citing, certain structures and areas that could be prone to flooding. Next slide.
All right, thank you, John. I'm just going to spend just a couple moments talking about some resources that are available to you from the New York State Floodplain Stormwater Managers Association. This is a screenshot of a portion of our homepage. There's an opportunity there to log in if you're a member, and we encourage you all to become members. It's $30 a year for individual membership, and you get some discounts on trainings or even free trainings depending upon certain situations. There's opportunities there. We also have some infographics that you can use for your own presentations if you wish, as well as links to different articles, resources, technical manuals, and things like that. Success stories that you can get more information on, or you can use again for your own, for your own presentations. So I'll just talk briefly about our training opportunities. So each year in the spring, we have an annual conference. Last year we didn't have it because of COVID. We're hoping, fingers crossed, to have it again in the spring of this year. 2022. And this will be in Schenectady. It'll be at the Lanny Hotel. I believe it was going to be early May is when it's going to be held, but there'll be more information about that coming out shortly. We do workshops. Usually it's on a regional topic. I wasn't involved in it, but recently we had a workshop for our Long Island constituents talking about coastal issues related to Long Island, very successful. Our website, completely enhanced last year in 2020. And in fact, it received our chapter received an award for outstanding chapter because of the work that we did on our website. Again, I don't have time to go into every feature of it, but there's lots of opportunities to get additional information, educational resources from the website. And then new this year, we've been doing a lot more webinars, similar to kind of what we're doing today, where you can sign up and you'll learn about NFIP 101, elevation certificates. There's a whole host of other topics that that we won't go into, but there's opportunities there to get continuing education credit. And we try to get the continuing education credit for professional engineers, our code enforcement officers, as well as certified floodplain managers and occasionally planners as well. And again, here's just a snapshot of a portion of our training website, opportunities to link to technical manuals and other resources on floodplain management, letters of map change, flood insurance studies, community range system, and a whole host of different topics as it relates to floodplain management. And just to kind of wrap up, as we discussed for the last hour and a half, current approaches can create future disasters. So if we continue to encourage at-risk development and ignore the impacts of others, can we accept these consequences? And perhaps even more importantly, are you willing to pay for them? It might sound good to put development in a floodplain. It's a kind of a quick and easy thing to increase the tax base of a community, but there are consequences for doing that, as we saw throughout the presentation. And just to go back briefly to what Janet had mentioned earlier about no adverse impact, it is the civic duty of local governments to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the people who are served. And I'm not going to attempt the Latin, but I will say simply the translation, which is, so use your own property that you do not injure others. And this is not a new concept. And we've been talking, again, throughout this last hour and a half about, not using your property to using your property as you wish, but not so that it's detrimental to others around you, your neighbors upstream, downstream, adjacent to you. This is not something new. This is not something that happened, within the last few years or even last century. This goes all the way back to ancient Roman law. So this is a very sound legal basis to it. And that's all that we have. On behalf of myself, Janet and John, I want to thank you all for taking your time to spend some time with us today. We enjoyed this greatly, and we hope that you guys learned something. So with that, for the time that we have left, we'll be happy to stick around and answer any questions you might have.
Thank you to the speakers. Very informative presentation. I'd just like to let the AICP planners know that we will endeavor to update the credit hours for this session to 1.5. I have some great news to share about the upcoming session on October 27th at noon about recreational marijuana and planning and zoning implications. We have added a panelist to that session. The chairman of the Cannabis Control Board, Tremaine Wright, will be on the panel explaining all the ins and outs of recreational marijuana, the opt-out provision. But one thing that you cannot do is opt out of the commercial operation. There's a reason why a euphemism for marijuana is skunk. So please tune in 12 p.m. October 27th for all that information. Again, I'd like to thank our speakers, and please copy down their email addresses and please follow up with them directly with any questions. Many thanks.